what was done for Du Bois has only been done one other time in the history of the university.
But in order to talk about why this celebration of the life and work of Jessie Redmon Fauset and the Harlem Renaissance is the perfect place for this work to be exhibited, and in order to introduce the artist, we welcome to the stage Dr. Leslie Shannon Curtis. Dr. Curtis is an expert in Haitian and French literature and culture who teaches in the French, Women's Studies, and Humanities departments at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Curtis earned her BA in International Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1999, her MA in French from Middlebury College in 2003, and her PhD in French and Francophone Studies from Duke University in 2011. Her work on the development of abolitionist movements in France and the literature of Haiti that influenced those movements has earned her numerous awards and fellowships, including the Julian Price Endowed Dissertation Research Fellowship and the prestigious Ernestine Friedel Research Award. She's given lectures nationally and internationally, and she has had a place at the table in prestigious academic meetings globally, including at the Clinton Institute for American Studies in Dublin, Ireland. She is currently translating into English for the first time Émeric Bergeau's Stella, which is the earliest novel written in post-revolutionary Haiti. And she's also at the same time completing a new scholarly book titled Haiti and Post-Colonialism in the 19th Century. I have the great privilege as well of calling her my wife. With that, Dr. Leslie Shannon Curtis.
Hi, thank you, Cord. So after visiting the Pan-African Congress in London in 1921, Jessie Redmon Fauset wrote of her experience, quote, "in the shadows of Westminster Abbey." She noted, quote, "many significant happenings had those cloisters looked down on, but surely on none more significant than on this group of men and women of African descent, so different in rearing and tradition, and yet so similar in purpose." This similar purpose has as one of its foundational memories the Haitian Revolution. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance, including Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, traveled to Haiti in the 1930s. The inspiration that they found in Haiti has much to do with the country's impressive history. Haiti is the result of the first successful slave revolt in the Americas. At the end of the 1700s, the French controlled the slave colony of Saint-Domingue on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, which is where Christopher Columbus landed for the first time. Though the abolition of slavery had been a subject of debate, no movement had been made. Slave owners in Paris formed a powerful and solid bloc against any changes. In 1791, the enslaved took matters into their own hands. They began what we now know as the Haitian Revolution. This resulted in the abolition of slavery in 1793, forcing France to be the first European power to abolish slavery in its colonies. Napoleon's attempt to reestablish slavery in 1801 led to independent Haiti in 1804. The Haitian leader Jean-Jacques Dessalines famously declared that he had, quote, avenged America. Free since 1804, Haitians have struggled to maintain that independence through 2 centuries of threat, economic exploitation, dictatorships, and foreign occupation. But throughout these difficulties, the country has been an inspiration to people of African descent in the Americas, and more broadly, to all those fighting against oppression. So tonight, I'd like you to think about that long history of which Jessie Redmon Fauset is certainly a part, as we are delighted to welcome Haitian artist Frandy Jean, whose art is definitely part of this long tradition of freedom and celebration. Thanks.
Before we hear from tonight's keynote speaker, I thought I might offer you a few reflections on this year's theme, poetry as protest. We are engaged here at once in a local and a global endeavor. What do I mean by that? I mean, after all, this seems to just be the school gym in little old Lawnside, itself only 2.2 square miles, right? But we're celebrating something bigger than this space and bigger than any of us. We are also remembering something. We are considering something central to our very existence. We're celebrating, remembering, and considering the facts that humanity, hope, and oppression are global. That protest as well is global, and so is poetry. On humanity, hope, and oppression, Ghanaian-born, British-educated, and American-based philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah reflects on ethics on this globe called Earth in his 2007 book, Cosmopolitanism: Ethics in a World of Strangers. He contrasts our globalized world with the local world of the ancient past, in which, quote, most people knew little about the ways of other tribes and could affect just a few local lives. But now, he writes, thanks to the World Wide Web of information, radio, television, telephones, the internet, we can affect lives anywhere, and we can also learn about life anywhere, too. For the same reasons, he writes, quote, we can raise standards of living by adopting new policies on trade and aid, prevent or treat diseases with vaccines and pharmaceuticals, take measures against global climate change, encourage resistance to tyranny, and a concern for the worth of each human life. But that, unfortunately, is not all. He also writes, we can also ruin poor farmers by dumping our subsidized grain into their markets, cripple industries by punitive tariffs, deliver weapons that will kill thousands upon thousands. Long before the internet, though, in an age equally touched by global relations and reeling from a world war that proved it, Jessie Redmon Fauset and her milieu sought to harness the positive parts of world contact in order to combat the global oppression that of what she, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others called the, quote, darker races of the world. In her 1921 report titled Impressions of the Second Pan-African Congress, she writes, quote, the dream of a Pan-African Congress had already come true in 1919. Yet it was with hearts half wondering, half fearful, that we ventured to realize it afresh in 1921. So tenuous, so delicate had been its beginnings. Had the black world, although once stirred by the terrific rumblings of the Great War, relapsed into its lethargy? Then out of Africa, just before it was time to cross the Atlantic, came a letter. One of many, but this the most appealing word from the Egyptian Sudan. Quote, sir, we cannot come, but we are sending you this small sum, $17.32, to help toward the expenses of the Pan-African Congress. Oh, sir, we are looking to you, for we need help sorely. So with this in mind, I'm still quoting Fauset here. So with this in mind, we crossed the seas, not knowing just what would be the plan of action for the Congress. For would not its members come from the four corners of the earth and must therefore of necessity have a diversity of opinion, of thought, of project? But the main thing, the great thing, was that Ethiopia's sons, through delegates, were stretching out their hands from all over the black and yearning world. You see, Jessie Fauset knew that the pain suffered by black and brown peoples, and with them those of lighter shade but of the wrong religion, ethnicity, or space, is global. And that the stretching out of hands, the crying out, the protest, must be global too, and poetic. Before I say a few words about our keynote speaker, I leave you with a few lines from Fauset's own poetry. She writes, if this is peace, this dead and leaden thing, then better far the hateful fret, the sting. Better the wound forever seeking balm than this gray calm. Is this pain surcease? Better far the ache, the long-drawn dreary day, the night's white wake. Better the choking sigh, the sobbing breath, than passion's death. Her poem, called Dead Fires, is about how a peace that is not just, but is nothing more than a false peace. Or in other words, how the desire for peace must not be allowed to overtake justice, which often requires sacrifice and pain. Passion for justice, then, may bring pain, but poetry expresses that pain. It's an outlet for it. And poetry, as protest, keeps passion alive. And at that, it opens our eyes and allows us to envision that glorious day when globally the dark night will fade into the long-awaited joy that cometh in the morning. Speaking of joy, it is mine and that of the Lawnside Historical Society to welcome to the podium Dr. Herman Beavers. Dr. Beavers is Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses in 20th century African American literature and creative writing. During the 2009 through 10 academic year, he served as a visiting fellow at Princeton's Center for African American Studies and delivered one of the keynote addresses at the Symposium on African American Literature at China Central Normal University in Wuhan, China. Professor Beavers earned his doctorate in American Studies at Yale University, where he also received a master's degree in Afro-American Studies. He completed a master's in creative writing from the writing program at Brown University. And he's also published a chapbook of poems entitled A Neighborhood of Feeling, as well as the scholarly monograph Wrestling Angels into Song, the fictions of Ernest J. Gaines and James Allen McPherson. He's completing right now 2 scholarly projects, The Geography of Risk, Representation Jazz and the Poetics of Conduct, 1947 through 2005, as well as Loud Cannons, African American Literature and the Politics of Racial Uncertainty, which uses chaos and system theory to read canonical texts in African American literature. And at that, he is nearing completion of a new volume of poems, which we all cannot wait to read, titled Tundra of Yes. And with that, Dr. Beavers.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm good friends with someone who's from Lawnside named Kate Rushin. She's a fellow poet. And I saw Kate last month at a symposium for our teacher, Michael Harper. He taught both of us at Brown University. And she had heard about the fact that I was coming to give the keynote address at the Jessie Redmon Fauset event, and she was wishing me Godspeed, but she was also sharing with me wonderful stories about the city of Lawnside, and so it's a doubly wonderful pleasure to be here. What I thought I would do is move forward from the remarks about the global and the local in terms of the early 20th century and talk for just a moment before I read some poems out of my book about the state of African American poetry and what that means in relationship to the whole notion of politics, poetry and politics. And so one of the things that I want to begin talking about is the notion of democracy and what Robert Hartley calls fragile democracy. Now, after taking a survey of students Hartley found that 66% of students felt it was important to keep up with current events and political affairs. That was in 1981. By 2011, that figure had dropped to 25%. Now, after the events of this week, one can see why that might be a problem, and why Hartley talks about the idea of fragile democracy. One of the things that he wants us to think about is the role of education in doing what he calls shoring up democracy. And he goes further and asks the question, what sort of dialogue should the university and education at large foster to create better citizens? How do discussions across lines of difference help us to build stronger and more secure notions of democracy? Now, one of the things that I would say is that Hartley makes a distinction between theory and praxis, and the need to integrate knowledge as a way of creating an entry point into any classes, any set of ideas, subject matter. But it leads me to think about the idea of building bridges. At this particular moment, we have the largest number of women of college age in U.S. history. And one of the reasons why that's important, and among that number, we have the largest number of African American girls of college age in U.S. history. One of the reasons why that's important is because I see this as an opportunity that, if we are successful, can have a transformative effect on the Black community. One of the reasons why it is so often the case that Black children suffer in poverty is because they are raised in single-parent homes where their mothers are poor. So the relationship, the correlation between poverty and single-parent households would seem to be both self-evident, but also a difficult conundrum to get out of. But one of the things that I want to say is, if we are successful in motivating young women to go to college, we will create an opportunity for women to, A, lift themselves out of their present circumstance, but we also create what I like to think of as the next leadership class. Now, mind what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we should do this at the expense of Black boys, but I am saying that at the present moment, there are more Black women in medical school, there are more Black women in law school, there are more Black women in graduate school seeking PhDs than Black men. We would be foolish. We would be foolish indeed to pass up that opportunity. And so the opportunity to come and think about Jessie Redmon Fauset, the first woman to get a college degree from Cornell University in 1905, that resonates in very important ways, largely because I think that this discussion about what happens with Black women in education is a way to build a bridge between our larger public purpose, but also the idea of what happens, as Professor Whitaker talked about, with the idea of this idea of the global and the local. One of the real, I think, misunderstandings about the moment in which Jessie Redmon Fauset lived and worked is that everything that was happening with regard to African American writing and African American art was happening in Harlem. Hence we call it the Harlem Renaissance. But I think that's a real misnomer, in part because Sterling A. Brown, one of her contemporaries, was in Virginia. Jean Toomer, another one of her contemporaries, was in Brooklyn. There are dozens of writers that were nowhere near the East Coast. And so one of the things that I often caution my graduate students about when they start to talk about the Harlem Renaissance is the idea of making something that is actually much wider in scope into a smaller local phenomenon. The same would be true of the Black Arts Movement. The Black Arts Movement, we often like to think of as a phenomenon that happened largely on the East Coast, but in fact, I would submit that there are a series of Black arts movements in a number of different places. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, I can assure you the Black Arts Movement was operative in Cleveland, Ohio. In fact, there was a very important poet from that moment named Russell Adkins, whom I happened to meet as an 18-year-old college freshman, almost by accident. And it's only after doing some research later that I found out how important he was to the Black arts movement. Though his name never gets mentioned, his name is often sort of obscured by people like Baraka and Haki Madhubuti. One of the things that Jessie Redmon Fauset invites us to think about is the fact that she took it upon herself to create opportunities for writers to hone their craft. And this is really important. I'm looking at my friend Sandra Barnes, and Sandra and I have taken poetry workshops together. And one of the things that she can say is when you get people around a table talking about poetry, it can get pretty heated, but the wonderful thing about that is you're working through how to make the poem work. And Jessie Fauset, in creating her salon in her home, really did create a space in which African American writers could think about and think through how to become better writers. Now, what does that have to do with what I said earlier? What it has to do with what I said earlier is that this black woman who is an Ivy League graduate at a time when black people were not in the Ivy League. I want you to think for a second how hard that must have been. I guarantee you nobody probably wanted to room with her. And the other thing is, one of the running jokes that my female students have with me about coming to college is, particularly in predominantly white institutions, are the questions that they get about their hair and how to do their hair. And if you sort of take that sort of notion and tell us go back to 1901 when she arrived at Cornell, at that time, white people thought that black people's hair was poisonous. It's the reason why they made black men who worked on the trains as waiters wear hairnets. And so if you think about that, if you think about all the myths that existed about black people at the time when she arrived at Cornell, the fact that she left there to create this opportunity for black writers, but more importantly, she went on to a career as an educator, first at Dunbar High School in Washington, and then later at DeWitt Clinton High School in New York. And judging by the dates, it's pretty clear to me she must have taught James Baldwin. James Baldwin is DeWitt Clinton class of 1947. She must have taught James Baldwin at some point in time, which means that there are all of these intersections with Jessie Redmon Fauset that are really important. Which, before I turn to the poems, I just want to leave you with this. The idea that someone like her could blaze the trail. Again, it had to have been hard. I was the only black student in my class at Brown in the graduate writing program. And what made it difficult was the people that I wanted to write about, the people in my graduate seminar in fiction, they were people that they saw as people that mopped floors and took out the trash, but those people were my uncle and my grandmother. And so what made it very difficult was trying to sort of listen and use my ear in my community and translate that to what happened on the page, and people saying, I really don't understand how these people are talking. Why are they using double negatives? Now, anybody that has a grandmother knows that if your grandmother says to you, you bet not never do that again. That's not bad English. That means you're in trouble. And it says something very important about how we use language. One of the things about what we call African American vernacular English, one of the things about the use of the double negative, it's not bad English, it's actually an amplifier for a point. You could easily say, you better not do that again. But if you say, you bet not never do that again, you are conveying a message. And when you think about the fact that there are several African languages that transpose the verb and put it behind, put it in front of the noun, African American vernacular English makes some level of sense. So it's a pleasure to be here. And so what I thought I would do, I won't take too long to do this because it's 9 o'clock, but I did want to read some poems from the manuscript. The first poem I want to read. This is one of those poems. This is one of those poems that I actually wrote in the workshop Sandy and I were in together. This is called Catcher 2. When I see him, Daddy is 25 and oiling his catcher's mitt with blood. The leather darkening to a skeptical shade of midnight, dark as that cheap red wine he used to drink in Palermo, Padua, Turin. Thinking back to those days, he stops oiling, pauses long enough so I feel the exuberance and embarrassment of 25, that feeling of wanting more than my hands could ever hope to hold spread across my chest. When he goes back to oiling the mitt, caressing it, knowing what he and it will do, the way he'll nab the throw from short to tag Amos Jefferson out at the plate, the question rings through my head. Will I ever give anything, anyone, this kind of love? Would a woman's thigh, her naked shoulder blazing like a flame under a bush, be the eye gone blind, made whole? Daddy looks up from his work, his gaze drifting past me to take in a pair of high heels, stockings, a skirt so tight one night it would be worth 30 years, and he's saying, you know how I'm using this blood? She won't never understand. Scars. And this is a persona poem. So this is a poem in a persona. Scars. Yes, sir. It ain't no easy way to settle for less than what killing make possible. Here was my choices. Rotting on the farm down home, trying to make a living on shares, or put my hand to a few Germans before they put their hand to me. Which wasn't no choice at all, come to think about it. In 19, when I got back from France with my croix de guerre, I had to bury my medal and burn my uniform to ashes to keep from getting lynched. White boys figured I was bound to get out of line since I done been paid for killing white men's. Thing is, they was right. Dangerous? Damn if I won't. I can't even begin to help you understand how good I looked in that damn uniform. An old man remembers the guitar. And this has an epigraph from Toni Morrison. Anything dead coming back to life hurts. And one thing you need to know in this poem, Charlie Parker lived from 1921 to 1955. And again, this is a persona poem in a voice. An old man remembers the guitar. I met Bird at a house party in Jersey. It was 1957. Nigga asked me for $5 to buy pizza and wine. I stared at him like he was Jesus. He looked at me like I was some kind of haint. When I gave him the money, a 20 was all I had, he bent down to tie his shoelace, say, I heard better guitar watching Roy Rogers and Trigger, and walked away. That was 30 years ago. I don't think about it much except when some fool come around out to cut somebody whose story they don't know. Looky here, boy. Don't let nobody tell you truth will make you free. It won't do nothing but kill you. And you be mad rest of your natural born life. This next poem is called Hamilton Railroad Station, and just a quick word about it. You'll hear the first line in a second. I had that first line, I think, as early as 1993. And I could not figure out what to do with it, so I put it into a short story. That didn't work. I put it into what I thought was a novel. That didn't work. I put it into a play. That didn't work. I put it back into a poem. It didn't work for a very long time. And then I decided to sort of step back and try and listen to what this voice was trying to tell me, and to let the voice come forward and tell the story. Now, it's in the third person, but what this poem got finished because I let this voice in my head sort of have it say. So this is called Hamilton Railroad Station. He can't stop thinking about corn. Strong and serious as a woman, hands on her hips, waiting for the old man to come home and do damage. Black clouds, lightning and thunder, but no rain. This is a day he could love. It's so hot, sin sits closer to the ground than prayer. The crowd at the baseball field waits for the game to be called. He's looking for the last one out. The station master ambles under the clock, carrying a trumpet so shiny it could send light bounding off into space. A single note levitates loud and sweet on the air till the heat closes around it, leaving the wine of souls caught up in a soft rustle of forgetting, bodies leaving what they need behind. If he wasn't catching this train, he'd be picking cornholes out of his nails, heading to the back door of the farmhouse to see Alma Jean before her husband gets home. She'd stare at him for 5 seconds, then say, "Get on in here," like she was losing time and had a good mind to go over every inch of his body till she found it. Maybe that explains why he's come to hate the sight of a cornstalk, stripped to nothing, its green husk shrugged to the ground like the dress sliding off a woman with better things to do. Looking down the tracks, he can see clear to the next county. There's a ribbon of lightning lashing heaven to the ground. Now, this next poem, you all are the first to hear me read this poem. This is not a poem that I read. But the end of the poem, I think, resonates with what happened this week in Boston, which is why I'm going to read it. And sometimes you just want to hear it. You just want to hear how it sounds. This poem is called Havoc Street, the movie. A ghost ship full of Dutch sailors moves through the water like it could judge the world and find it wanting. The tall grass at the water's edge declines to speak up on my behalf. How can I invent myself, trying to explain who I'm for or where I last felt sharp pain, fixed on the construct of herbs? What with all the detritus spinning through space, clocks that can't keep good time, talk that turns the stars to bodies held fast, circling like suitors who don't catch the drift? It means something to stay in one place. Long Island, not Moline, Illinois. Danville, Pennsylvania, never Belleville, Kentucky. The houses we pass fit nicely in America. In a day or so, we'll see jockeys in all the best yards, throwing metal kisses to the wind, heavy with sarcasm, lanterns blank as questionnaires. A tolerable conclusion would be a sign of let up in the snowfall, the soft skin of a yellow tree. All those years I lived on Havoc Street. Here, a movie camera would pan the room, reveal the slow heave of my chest, pull back to show a ruined cake, a little boy calling out to his brother, cut to a door clicking to, a man's skull dreaming the business of hurt. This next poem is called Taking Up Bass. And it's wonderful that the band was playing bass. I was looking at the bass player longingly. And this poem talks about that, taking up bass. You don't need to know anything about me except for the fact that when I was 20, I was kidnapped by members of the Unification Church. Now stop looking at me like that. It was only for 10 minutes. Now it's true when I tell you they had me in the van, it felt like we were headed to see the Reverend. I don't have any bitterness. I know it's because my face is a book people read and think they know what's on the next page. But I'm telling this wrong. What I want to talk about is playing the upright bass. In my next life, bump fooling with nouns and verbs, I'm coming back as a bassist. It will mean I'll be born with longer fingers, but that's just the half of it. When I'm starting school, the first words I'll learn to scrawl on the yellow paper with the green lines are bottom and time. By the time I'm in the 7th grade, that time in my first life when I was wearing high-water pants and pining for the return of outdoor recess, I'll be hearing bass lines, chords running through my head like the rapid beating east to west across Cleveland. 1 minute I'll be making the first toddling steps to whispering nasty words into a 9th grader's ear. The next, I'll be wearing a replica of Paul Chambers' Tux, the bass line of So What ringing through the dark corridors of my head. My fingers moving of their own accord. This will mean my family will have to have a phone so that the agent can call. When the van pulls up to the house to take me on the road for my first tour, my parents and sister will be so proud they won't touch any of my stuff till I get back. After my last gig, which I'm not ashamed to say, will be in Omaha, Nebraska. Of course, this will mean that basketball won't make it into the story. And that will mean that I won't be coming home from a day on the court. I won't meet the woman with the smile that's neither here nor there. She won't ask me who my favorite comedian is. She won't ask me if I'm ever lonely. She won't say, join me for lunch. There are some friends I want you to meet. I'm telling you, everything will be different. As sure as this callus rising on my index finger, believe me when I tell you, nothing will be as it was. This next poem is a poetic form called the Sestina, and it's an Italian form. We don't quite know the full history of the Sestina, but it's a poem. As you listen to it, you'll hear that there are words that repeat throughout the poem. And so one of the things about the Sestina is that the last word in every line has to repeat in a periodic sequence. This Sestina has just been accepted for an anthology of Sestinas. It's called The Relative of Fear. And again, you guys are the first people to hear me read this. Nobody has heard this before. So y'all could run me out of here after this. Disaster can't be held at bay. A lover's cheating, the ill-fated flight, weapons wielded by angry relatives, a well-chosen word calculated to configure pain. We bask in the joke that is our power and posture in the reflected starlight of our names, as if the determined light slanting across the mouth of the bay is signature to our entitlement. A power so unique, we feel authorized for flight faster than thought, ciphers God uses to figure the exact weight of the universe relative to our importance. But arrogance is the relative of fear. How many lives are absent of light? The quality of darkness distorts the human figure, shaped so blurred it leaves our fears baying the brute strength of our convictions, as if flight would be to surrender the will to power through the shadows. No mistaking, power is at issue here. Is it real, a distant relative of wisdom? Could we eschew those flights of fancy to masquerade as light? Illuminating all we see, everyone will obey if we reject whimsicality, even if we figure blindness as insight. Understand we are figures in an incomplete equation. What if power is an architectural illusion, a bay window in a mile-high skyscraper, irrelevance by design? If the moon steals its light from the sun, what is lunar flight but a foray up the darkest flight of stairs we can imagine? A place that disfigures our plans to sally backward, a slight but necessary adjustment when our poor powers of perception reveal us to be relatives to fossilized nocturnal beasts who disobeyed the law of gravity, took flight as if the power bill would not come due, a relative position, a shadow falling across the bay. I was telling Melanie, who's my wife's soror, that just last year, W.E.B. Du Bois was made an honorary professor emeritus of sociology and Africana studies. And it was a particularly wonderful moment at Penn because in the 278-year history of the University of Pennsylvania, what was done for Du Bois has only been done one other time in the history of the university, where they conferred tenure on somebody posthumously. If you know the story of Du Bois, and perhaps you don't, Du Bois, when he was at the University of Pennsylvania, having just gotten his PhD from Harvard University, the first African American to get a PhD in the U.S. I mean, at Harvard, I'm sorry, not the U.S., at Harvard, having written 2 dissertations. He wrote a dissertation in Germany, but he ran out of funding, and so he had to come back to the States. He came back and wrote Suppression of the African Slave Trade as his substitute dissertation. When he came to the University of Pennsylvania in 1896, he had been brought to Philadelphia to basically study the black community and help the white city fathers conclude that black people were the reason why the city of Philadelphia, was falling into ruin. Du Bois, at a time before we had quantitative sociology, Du Bois set out to study the black community, and he set about to do that by painstakingly interviewing people in the 7th Ward. So if you've ever been to Philadelphia, the 7th Ward includes South Street and the streets on either side of South Street. It runs from about South Street over to about Pine Street. It's a very narrow strip, but a lot of black families lived in that area because that's where white people said that black people in Philadelphia could live. Du Bois then, with a slide rule, before computers, before calculators, he wrote the Philadelphia Negro, which is the first quantitative study in sociology of human beings in the United States. Only one other quantitative study had been done to that point, and it had been done in England. So literally, sociology as we know it today was created when Du Bois did the Philadelphia Negro. So when we decided to honor Du Bois, I was asked to write a poem, or what turned into a series of poems in his honor. So the next 3 poems I'm going to read are part of this series, and the title of the series is Plexus. W.E.B. Du Bois comes to Philadelphia, 1896 to 1897. And it has an epigraph for the entire series of poems, which reads, and this is Du Bois speaking from his autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, I served over a year at the University of Pennsylvania for the munificent sum of $600 and never railed at fate. Now, just another word, Du Bois didn't even have an office when he was at the University of Pennsylvania. So whenever I want to get on my high horse about being at the University of Pennsylvania, Du Bois paid for my right to be there. And when I think about the Philadelphia Negro and what he did, he loved black people. He loved black people so much that he went from door to door and interviewed just about every family in the 7th Ward to find out what were actually the problems in the black community. He loved us that much. So writing this poem was on the one hand difficult, but on the other hand, it was really a labor of love. The poem is in 3 sections. The first section is called Philadelphia 1896, the Progressive Era. And it has an epigraph from Michael Harper that reads, a blind nation in storm mauls its own harbors. Philadelphia 1896, the Progressive Era. Though we stand here, our fine clothes spattered with blood, it is not shame that moves us to act. What we undertake here is nothing short of necessary, this mapping of the labyrinth, in a moment when our feet trod over the prosperity of ruin, our city shivering under a gilded sun. For we find ourselves faced with the quandary of the age. What are the limits of our greatness? What blunt instrument might suffice to chart the boundaries of our knowing? Let there be no mistake. Though we sit astride the wrathful terror of the maelstrom, we will not hesitate to entitle ourselves the boldest of men. What care we about the eye of the needle? Our eyes accustomed to the maddening dark, disequilibrium our common sense, we will masquerade as the cleansing light. We will exalt every faltering candle and call it civic duty. The Science of Troubled Sleep, Philadelphia 7th Ward, 1896. It has 2 epigraphs. The first is from Charles Custis Harrison, who was at the time acting provost of the University of Pennsylvania. He said this, and he said this of Du Bois, I would not have known where to place or what to call him. And the second is from Du Bois's biographer, David Levering Lewis, but almost surely university authorities had initially seen him as an expendable black person brought there to do a predictable job. The Science of Troubled Sleep, Philadelphia 7th Ward, 1896. Before Cohen, before Logan, Medical Hall is haven for Capitol's liturgical instruments. The air dense with sugar, cooked into coin. Susan Wharton, her Quaker heart inoculated against sloth's viral ruin, throws her doors wide open, seeks a man of weapons, his bookshelf armed to the teeth. The Negro must be studied, a scientific musing on the city's tacit aerodynamics. Empiricisms glide into empire, the quest to determine once and for all the color of Darwinian drag. Sunlight slashes across the wall, birds everywhere from the sky falling. And that theory was that this great, rich, and famous municipality was going to the dogs because of the crime and venality of its Negro citizens, who live largely centered at the lower end of the 7th Ward. In the era of the progressive machine, rapacity's mechanical certitude, a moment when principle relinquishes to the propulsion of accumulated sin, pistons churning the body politic white with pathology's anxious myopia, barons holding the throttle open, municipal speed clocked in a plethora of Republican names, instrumental in sculpting the national monument, weighing on Homer Plessy's miscegenated brow, his stamp receipt counterpointing Chinese characters peeling inside Judge Harlan's dissent. I ignored the pitiful stipend. It made no difference to me that I was put down as an assistant instructor, and even at that, my name never actually got into the catalog. It goes without saying that I did no instructing. The moon's spoke blue glass dangles over the city's fissured vestibules, black cats athwart superfluous photographic plates, sympathetic hands scrolling into fist-clutching blood-stained dollars, razors stropped, an old man's tubercular rag. Among a cascade of open faces bearing traces of crime and excess, walking stick a howl of statistical inference, hands gloved in kid leather, you set out to corroborate the Negro's plexus of social problems. Your blues and algebraic moan charting how far the eye must travel before it gets used to the dark. My vision was becoming clearer. The Negro problem was in my mind a matter of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. The world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil, stupidity. Requiem, University of Pennsylvania, 2012, has an epigraph from David Levering Lewis. From an Olympus of scholarship and opinion, he waved his pen. This day, we make our way in a tumult of public scripts. Here, we cast our gaze behind us, turn to aching pillars of salt. In another, a 12-year-old with a 60-year-old heart learns the grammar of violence, painting the town in dread's brightest shade. Over here, we find the air alive with the thrum of colorblind buzzwords cloaked in Confederate gray, politics a cartoon frozen at the polls. In yet another, we seek purchase in a vortex of disbelief, squint in the roar of the headwind, tomorrow ourselves in the shifting sands of self-congratulation. The night sweats a toxic silence, scruples flying downhill at breakneck speed, ensorcelled in the piquancy of digital bliss. The critical imagination pedestaled in a museum standing at parade rest. In a moment such as this, let us picture the doctor at his desk dreaming. His pen, all that keeps the day from flying to pieces, he bends over a word puzzle, probing for a 5-letter word denoting struggle. Sweat? Might it be souls, truth, power? But then an epiphany from times past. He knows in the library of his bones, rebellion balances on the shoulders of a single word, human. Two more. Making Fast is a poem that I wrote to honor the life of someone that was very close to me, who died a death at a very young age. And the poem is actually about my grief at that moment. So it has an epigraph, "O navigator, guide me through grief's most brilliant storm." It's in 2 parts. The first part is called Cathexis, Making Fast. Rain is a language I've always known I could mimic. My life gothic as a minstrel's dance step, eyes grinning, heavy clouds muscling a thin and frightened moon. Black sky rhythm, deus ex machina annulled. At a distance, she's wearing a sleeveless black dress, blood wailing with protein's false promise, eyes half awake. Now she's kissing me behind the ear, waking me in the morning's rusted light. 2, pain management. Swing of the door's arc, the pure final tumble of the locks, tight sleep of the jam. In this rented house, My bedroom dilates with sound, makes idols of passing shadows, bright jet of breeze, sleesh of car tires on a rain-wet street, staring at the ceiling, pointless. Night presses in on the spine's tone-deaf xylophone. The patina of small, intricate wants glistens and hangs from my eyelashes. No melismatic raft to take me across this swelling river. Falling down history's blue chasm of regret, I discover a deep breath, eyelids sprung open, collapsing the partition connecting this world to the next, the promise beyond her hospiced eyes. And I'll end with what is actually the last poem in the book. It's called Obsidian Blues, number 43. And it's in 4 parts, but I will just read it all the way through. Obsidian Blues, number 43. Thimbles of rain shower roof dwellers. Start over again. Thimbles of rain shower roof dwellers with clear signs to hat across the river. Dead eyes of blank storefronts gape at catastrophe's jagged prophecy running from forehead to chin like an ethnographic scar, the weight of the world wombs double. Fist waving in hygienic chords of rage, sporting squalid tweed and dimpled tie, a saint tallies up syllables of candescent revolt, puts on like a miracle is the bad thumb of an astonished, confounded God. Speeding to a blur, wanging an electric guitar, strings juddering, a systolic ghost swagger in the envenomed wind. Call this the 21st century hobo rag. Call this the rock of spent wages. Call this blues concerto for left hand and scar. What we capture are words, ephemeral breeze on humid skin, apples, the way the light betrays them. Call this sunlight on an abandoned saxophone. Call this still life with apples and desk mask. Call this disappointment masquerading as light. Place the fingers correctly at the base of your neck, pulsing chords. Lift one finger, change the sound the same. Call this still life with guitar and heartstrike. Call this landscape with skull and banjo. Call this abstraction of the lost chord. No wind, only grace. A bright blue to fill in this place where voices pause, the last daub of paint, curve of the final brushstroke. Call this wheelhouse and boat wreck. Call this portrait of a breathless man. Call this sky as self-portrait. And what longs to become a tundra, a tundra, a tundra of yes.